that I've studied or been exposed to evangelical beliefs, the more alarmed I become. You see, their theology appears to have been created simply to discredit traditional religious beliefs. Often these are the beliefs within their same religion, creating, if you like, a cult within the religion itself, and seeking to distance themselves from the traditional parts of their own religion. Let me illustrate this with an argument from Peter Hitchens, someone I rarely agree with. I'm not certain I agree with him on this, but it's a great illustration. He argues that there is something sinister about Islam because it claims that Muhammad is the final prophet. Thus, no religion following Muhammad can be a true religion. I don't think Peter included this, but we Muslims believe that Muhammad was sent to man because we had not properly followed the teachings of the former prophets. A similar argument is that because Al-Quran has never been altered, it must represent what God wants us to do, unlike other scriptures. The implication in both being that Islam is the true religion and that all others are false. Now, I agree with Peter, this is very dangerous. It establishes tribalism within religion, rather like supporting a football team. Now, as a devout Muslim and Manchester City supporter, I can identify with this tribalism and indeed how destructive it really is. There are many shorts on this platform which portray such tribalism at Speaker's Corner in London, as though God will welcome us for having argued with other believers. But what I find so disturbing about these arguments is that they can never be tested, i.e. proved or disproved. They're simply an exercise in semantics. Those proposing them may selectively quote from Al-Quran or Hadith, but this too is simply semantics. You can see that I've been considering how belief systems attempt to establish themselves as the only true belief system by attacking other belief systems, even though in doing so they may be contradicting their own belief system. Well, it seems to me that science is the most perfect example of what I'm talking about. Now, before describing how science does this, I should admit that my original title was Materialism and not Science, as maybe theoretical physics is somewhat immune from my accusation. To the materialist science, for something to be true or real, it must be something that our senses can pick up on. Furthermore, that this reaction in our senses can be sensed by others using experimental conditions. But this limits knowledge to the limitations of our senses. Thus, because the quantum deals with such small particles, which cannot be observed, it is considered by many materialist science to be outside of science, i.e. purely theoretical and not provable. I will return to this later. The same would be true for those parts of the universe which are so far away that they cannot be observed by man. You have already identified one of the tensions within science that forms a part of my argument, haven't you? Yes, scientists use instruments to assist them in measurement, but at what point does measurement become purely theoretical? The truth is that scientists would not agree on this. A consensus would probably exist around if a phenomenon could be measured in any way and replicated, then it is still a science. But when it is purely a hypothesis derived from mathematics, then it is theoretical. Mathematics is widely seen as a pure language of science, not susceptible to misinterpretation. Thus, theoretical physics could be seen as the purest of sciences, but few scientists would agree with this. At the heart of quantum physics and the social sciences is the probability curve, something which can be observed and measured across a whole range of natural phenomena. But rarely is this probability curve applied to and within science itself. Karl Popper, 28th of July 1902 to 17th September 1994, was an Austrian-British philosopher, academic and social commentator, and one of the 20th century's most influential philosophers of science. Popper rejected the classical inductivist view on the scientific method for empirical falsification. For Popper, what made science was that it was open to falsification. That is, there is a method of proving a hypothesis to be wrong. This is part of the scientific method, which proposes a hypothesis, tests the hypothesis through experimentation, analyses the data before reporting on the results. But for Popper, scientists are concerned with falsifying their hypothesis through experimentation rather than proving it. This ability to falsify is what makes science special, differentiating it from other disciplines. Being a logical criterion, it proposes to make the theory predictive and testable, and thus useful in practice. Popper is thus able to distinguish between science and pseudoscience. Pseudoscience being something which may utilise scientific concepts, even scientific languages, but because its hypothesis is not falsifiable, it could not be science. This accusation of pseudoscience is commonly used by those enamoured by science towards anything they don't agree with. Indeed, the accusation that it isn't science is used as though this was a logical argument in itself. Popper's parents were friends with Freud's sister, Rosa Graf, and he uses psychoanalysis as an example of pseudoscience, as it always proposes a solution, and never concludes that there isn't one. The same might be argued for all of psychology, maybe all social science. As a former Marxist, Popper saw Marxism as an example of pseudoscience. Marx claimed that through historical materialism, his predictions of capitalism being overthrown by a proletarian revolution was actually science. But given that, using strict Marxist terms, capitalism has never been overthrown by a proletarian revolution, how can it be disproved? According to Popper, a theory in the empirical sciences can never be proven, but it can be falsified, meaning that it can and should be scrutinised with decisive experiments. In other words, the scientific method does not prove anything, simply seeks to disprove it, i.e. to falsify it. Despite this, the media portrays science as having proved this or that, and increasingly scientists are willing to go along with this view. Popper said that not all falsifiable statements are useless in science. Mathematical statements are good examples. Like all formal science, mathematics is not concerned with the validity of theories based on observations in the empirical world, but rather mathematics is occupied with the theoretical, abstract study of subjects, such as quantity, structure, space and change. Methods of mathematical science are, however, applied in constructing and testing scientific models, dealing with observable reality, because statisticians often associate statistical inference with induction. Popper's philosophy is often said to have a hidden form of induction. Bertrand Russel, 18th of May 1872 to the 2nd of February 1970, was a British mathematician, philosopher, logician and public intellectual. He had a major influence on mathematics, logic, set theory, linguistics, artificial intelligence, cognitive science, computer science, and various areas of analytical philosophy, especially philosophy of mathematics, philosophy of language, epistemology, and metaphysics. As a child in the early 1960s, Russel, as I was a child in the early 1960s, Russel was a regular on British television and always highly entertaining. In mathematical logic, Russell's paradox, also known as Russell's antinomy, is a set theoretical paradox published in 1901. Russell's paradox shows that every set theory that contains an unrestricted comprehensive principle leads to a contradiction. According to the unrestricted comprehension principle, for any sufficiently defined property, there is a set of all and only the objects that have that property. So, if we express it, let R be the set of all sets and not members of themselves. If R is not a member of itself, then its definition entails that it is a member of itself. Yet, if it is a member of itself, it is not a member of itself, since it is a set of all sets and not all members of themselves. The resulting contradiction is the paradox. Attempting to simplify this as a nested set within a set will contain a contradiction. A common example being, suppose a barber shaves all men who do not shave themselves, and only men who shave themselves. When one thinks about whether the barber should shave himself or not, the paradox becomes apparent. Thus the presence of the contradictions, like Russell's paradox, show that if any formula can be proved to be true, it destroys the conventional meaning of truth and falsity. As set theory was seen as the basis for an axiomatic development of all other branches of mathematics, Russell's paradox threatened the very foundation of mathematics. Although many solutions to the paradox have been proposed, including two by Russell himself, none are entirely satisfactory in resurrecting confidence in mathematics as a language not open to interpretation. A similar contradiction is the Burali-Forti Paradox, which demonstrates that constructing a set of all ordinal numbers leads to a contradiction and therefore shows the antinomy in a system that allows its construction. Corey's paradox is a paradox in which arbitrary claim F is proved from the mere existence of sentence C. That is, that if C, then F, requiring only a few apparently innocuous logical deduction rules. Since F is arbitrary, any logic having these rules allows one to prove everything. I'd not come across this prior to researching this topic, but it seems to agree with my view that if we look hard enough for the evidence of our beliefs, we will indeed find it. The Kleene paradox shows that certain systems of formal logic are inconsistent. Thus a version of Haskell-Curry's combination and Alonzo Church's original Lambda calculus are both originally intended as systems of formal logic. The number paradox arises from attempts to classify every natural number as either interesting or uninteresting. The paradox states that every natural number is interesting. The proof is by contradiction. If there exists a non-empty set of uninteresting natural numbers, there would be a smallest uninteresting number. But the smallest uninteresting number is itself interesting because it is the smallest uninteresting number, thus producing the contradiction. System U and System U are special forms of a typed Lambda calculus with an arbitrary number of sorts, axioms and rules, or dependencies between the sorts. They were proved both to be inconsistent by Jean-Yves Girard in 1972. And now to my favourite, Gödel's incompetence theorems. These are two theorems of logic that are concerned with the limits of provability in formal axiomatic theories. The first incompleteness theorem states that no consistent systems of axioms whose theorems can be listed in an effective procedure, i.e. an algorithm, is capable of proving all truths about the arithmetic of natural numbers. For any such consistent formal system, there will always be statements about natural numbers that are true, but they are unprovable within the system. The second incompleteness theorem, an extension of the first, shows that the system cannot demonstrate its own consistency. Thus, Gödel's incompleteness theorems were the first of several closely related theorems on the limitations of formal systems. Gödel was my inspiration when developing the hypothesis that everything is both true and untrue simultaneously. Now, maybe I'm guilty of scientism here, but what these various inconsistencies appear to be pointing to is that the logical consistency, which is fundamental to science itself, is itself inconsistent. In other words, science claims to be pure and unaffected by outside influences cannot be logically proven. Thus, science is simply another belief system. Carl Sagan, November the 9th, 1934 to December the 20th, 1996, was an American astronomer, planetary scientist, cosmologist, astrophysicist, astrobiologist, science communicator, author and educator. I do not propose to describe Karl's contribution to science, but his views on science have been highly influential on scientists themselves, such that he is very regularly quoted or paraphrased by scientists. Like Russel, Sagan was a TV personality and did much to popularise science to a generation after mine, including Brian Cox, whom I had a very interesting conversation with one afternoon in the George in Soho. Now, that conversation did touch on Bell's inequality theorem, but I was much more interested in discussing with Brian that things could only get better. Karl's famous quote is that science is not perfect. It can be misused, it's only a tool, but is by far the best tool we have, self-correcting, ongoing, applicable to everything. It has two rules. First, there are no sacred truths. All assumptions must be critically examined. Arguments from authority are worthless. Second, whatever is inconsistent with the facts must be discarded or revised. The obvious is sometimes false, the unexpected is sometimes true. And this has inspired so many who see science as pure and neutral, despite this really implying the opposite. So often he is misquoted by missing out the opening lines, just as those using the scriptures to support their arguments so often do. In fact, I find it remarkably similar to a quote from my hero, Sir John Dee. A marvellous neutrality, have all things mathematical, and also a strange participation between the supernatural, immortal, intellectual, simple and invisible, and things natural, mortal, sensible, compounded and divisible. Nevertheless, there is plenty that Karl said which could be interpreted as encouraging a normative view of science. The reason science works so well is partly this built-in error-correcting machinery. There are no forbidden questions in science, no matters too sensitive or delicate to be probed, no sacred truths, the openness to new ideas, combined with the most rigorous skeptical scrutiny of all ideas, sifts the wheat from the chaff. It makes no difference how smart, august or beloved you are. You must prove your case in the face of determined and expert criticism. Diversity and debate are valued, opinions are encouraged to contend, substantively and in depth. Furthermore, he didn't argue that scientists are immune from bias and do not bring their background and socialisation into the inquiry. Science is part and parcel neutral. Scientists do not seek to impose their needs and wants on nature, but instead humbly interrogate nature and take seriously what they find. We're aware that revered scientists have been wrong. We understand human imperfection. We insist on independent and, to the extent possible, quantitative verification of proposed tenets and beliefs. We're constantly prodding, challenging, seeking contradictions or small, persistent residual errors, proposing alternative explanations, encouraging heresy. We give our highest reward to those who convincingly disprove established beliefs. In fact, Karl does criticise other belief systems, based on his view of the objectivity of science and the scientist, just as I initially argued that science did exactly this. Science is a way to call the bluff of those who pretend to knowledge. It is a bulwark against mysticism, against superstition, against religion misapplied to where it has no business being. If we're true to its values, it can tell us where we're being lied to. It provides a mid-course correction to our mistakes. Whilst this objectivity may be a goal for scientists, I would argue that it's impossible to escape our own prejudices and how these impact on our inquiry and conclusions. All too often, when anyone mentions anything seen as critical of science, we are reminded of the advancements in medicine, although of course the last few years should have taught us the absolute opposite is now true. Thus science becomes a panacea for humanity, which is a part of my argument that it simply becomes another belief system. And to quote Karl again, I know of no area of human endeavour in which science has not at least one important thing to say. My argument is thus that science and scientists are nothing like as objective as most would lead us to believe. Recent years have shown how science has been manipulated by business interests, including the refereed journal system for publications and the very process of conducting research and reporting on it. Of course, the scientists would rightly blame business for this, but how could this have happened if science and scientists are impenetrably neutral? Our confidence has further been shaken by reports of fraud in some of the very most prestigious institutions. Such evidence began in psychology, but it would now seem that it is something which has affected all subjects. If we cannot rely on scientists actually remaining objective and applying the scientific method, then what can we trust? Of course, such evidence will be downplayed by claiming that there is a few bad apples, whereas I can see some evidence of something fundamentally rotten within science itself. The refereed journal system is the key to an academic career, but not unnaturally they want to publish positive results, not those which are being falsified or inconclusive. But such research, according to Popper, is what makes science science. Furthermore, there is plenty of evidence of scientists not following the scientific method, but taking shortcuts based on hunches. This is only natural. Undoubtedly, it saves a lot of time and money in conducting research. But again, it contradicts what Popper sees as fundamental to science. Let me be clear, I'm not rubbishing science, nor suggesting that just because there are inconsistencies and fraud, that all science is of no value. Even though this is exactly the line of argument so many scientists take when, for example, attempting to dismiss the paranormal, or even, for that matter, religion. No, I'm simply saying that science, like fundamentalist religions, should not be taken at face value, just because it seems so normative and its promoters seem so assertive, to the point of aggression. Returning to my original statement, science is a belief system like everything else, a belief system originating within the Enlightenment and thus incorporating all the myths and prejudices of the Enlightenment. Like all belief systems, it's prone to confirmation bias and rejecting the counterfactual, however much scientists protest that it doesn't. Not convinced? Well, what about the inevitable progress of mankind, which informs Carl Sagan's views on the advancement in health and agriculture? Advancements in medicine and agriculture have saved vastly more lives than have been lost in all the wars in history. Maybe I chose Carl Sagan because he best illustrates my points about the myths of science, albeit, let me say, I have a lot of time for Karl, because this is a belief which cannot be tested. This itself is not science. Of course, scientists will point to innovation and dark chapters in human history, observations coloured by their belief in this myth and having rejected evidence of the counterfactual. And as Graham Hancock knows only too well, often viciously. Then again, underpinning this myth is another, that time is linear. This cannot be proven using the scientific methods. Yes, we can measure mechanical movements, electronic impulses, chemical reactions. But is this time? You might argue that the change in seasons or the movement from day to night. But for me, these confirm that time is, if indeed it exists, is cyclical and not linear. But above all, they confirm the existence of God. Yes, my views are informed by my beliefs. And that is my very point. So too are those of scientists.